In 1954, the world's most famous fashion magazine, Vogue, released this image of a woman wearing a hat with corpses of animals in the background. At this point in time, they were far from knowing that this was the start of one of photography's darkest geniuses, Guy Bourdin. The life of Guy Bourdin can be summarized quite quickly. He was born in 1928 in Paris, in France, and his parents separated after he was born. He therefore lived with his paternal grandparents and his father, and it is said that he only saw his mother once.
He told me once when he was in the restaurant Bourdin, that this woman came, sort of, elegant, and he was told it was his mother, which he had never seen. She brought him some present, and then she left. It was the only image he had of her.
The fact of having been abandoned by his own mother clearly had an influence on Bourdin's life and career. We might get back on that later and on some other points of his biography, but for now we will focus on how Guy Bourdin changed fashion photography forever. Before talking specifically about the change that Bourdin undertook, it is important to know what was fashion photography like before Guy Bourdin. So Bourdin's images arrived at a time where fashion photography was bigger than it had ever been. After gradually replacing illustrations, photography became the favorite medium to communicate about fashion in the 30s. At this time, photographers such as Edwin Blumenstein, Edward Steichen, or even Louis Dahl Wolff were the most popular. In the 50s, the fashion industry was catching back from war, and the budgets allocated to photography by fashion brands were bigger than ever before.
Here comes the money. Here we go. Money talk.
Some of fashion photography's most renowned actors started their career at around this time, such as, for example, Richard Avedon, William Klein, or Irving Penn. Bourdin has always been less famous than the three of them that you might have already heard of, because Bourdin always refused to publish his images in an autonomous way. Their place was in fashion magazines and only there. As stated in the introduction, it was in the mid-50s that Bourdin made its entry in fashion photography without anyone knowing that he would leave his indelible trace on it. And now you must be wondering what was so special and unique about Bourdin's work for him to still be influential today. Well, this question can be answered by focusing on three characteristics that Bourdin's work has and that were contrasting a lot with what fashion photography was like at the time. The first thing is Bourdin's surrealism, the second one is his use of models, and the third one is the darkness of his images. The first thing that made Bourdin stand out from the rest of the fashion photographers was the fact that Bourdin was a surrealist. Now you must be wondering, what is surrealism? So surrealism is an art movement whose actors were using creative processes involving our psychic experiences, such as our unconscious, our dreams, or our automatisms, in order to create artworks. It was a way to create art that was freed from our reasoning and that was dependent on perhaps the deepest parts of our mind. One of the most well-known surrealists at the time was Man Ray. Bourdin was very appreciative of Man Ray's work, and since they were both living in Paris, it seemed natural to ask Man Ray to become his mentor. With this idea in mind, Bourdin went and knocked 6 times on the door of Man Ray, and he was rejected by Man Ray's wife the same amount of time.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
The 7th time Guy Bourdin went there, Man Ray opened and accepted to sign the preface of Guy Bourdin's first exhibition. He described Bourdin in this way: Guy Bourdin is very young. This is already in his favor. I won't say whether Guy Bourdin has anything significant to show us. I don't like praise. Nevertheless, I can say that Guy Bourdin is trying hard not to only be a good photographer. 7 years later, we can see that Man Ray was right. Bourdin is not only a good photographer, he is an accomplished artist that revolutionized fashion photography, and Man Ray's influences probably played a role in that. These surrealist influences and the creative processes that are in link with it clearly had an influence on the work that Bourdin produced. It is, for example, said that he used to take sleeping pills to dream for longer and therefore have more substrate on which to ground his work. We can of course see some obvious influences from Man Ray and Magritte, for example, with regards to surrealist painters, but more than surrealism, we can see in Bourdin's images that he had a great knowledge of painting. He went to Les Beaux-Arts in Paris, and we can see in his compositions that he knew how to make things work in a frame. But we can also see a lot of different painting movements that have influenced Bourdin and that made him produce the work that he produced. For example, we can see that there are some Baroque influences because of the fact that the models are always a bit in the middle of a movement and that there is a lot of tension in the images. Perhaps more obviously, we can see an influence from Rothko's color field in some of Bourdin's images, such as this one, for example. The colors, the focus on young women, and some of the compositions are quite similar in Bourdin and Balthus' work. We can also see some similarities between Hopper and Bourdin's work. The weird geometries can recall Giorgio de Chirico. But to be really honest, it would be really hard to make a list of all the artists that influenced Bourdin. It just seems like Bourdin took the best of paintings and diluted it in his photography. I will talk in more details about how Bourdin achieved this surrealism in the next two sections, but for now let's focus on a comparison between Bourdin and another surrealist fashion photographer that you may know, Helmut Newton. Although both of them have a lot of similarities in their career, they started around the same time, they shot for Vogue, we can still see a few differences in their work, they are not that similar. In Newton's images, everything is done to bring the model to life. For example, by making the model's skin shine with a certain vitality. Bourdin was making the complete opposite. He figuratively killed the model by giving it a corpse-like look, thanks to the use of deathly tones, or even with a makeup that made the models look like dolls. Bourdin's images also tends to be way darker than the ones of Newton, as we will see it later. To conclude this section about Bourdin's surrealism, it must be said that Bourdin really participated in making a shift in fashion photography. From borrowing commercial images displaying a product to images with a strong narrative that happened to have a product in them, Bourdin really participated in forging what fashion photography is today. Before we jump into the next section of this video, I would like to remind you to subscribe and like this video if you have liked it and if my fucking accent was not too bothersome.
Just be you, be proud of you, because you can do what we want to do.
So, the second thing that I wanted to talk to you about Bourdin that is really characteristic about his work is the way he uses models. Bourdin was known for his will to work with non-professional models or models with very few experience. This allowed him to work with models that had no preconceived ideas of how to pose or of how a studio session should go. While you might think that this gave him more freedom to create the images that he wanted, which is true, it also had a darker side where it made him more manipulative with the models. As you might guess it now, Bourdin was really demanding with the models, as this testimony can show it.
Usually there were 2 or 3 girls, and you were never sure if you were going to be the favorite of the day. And so you kind of watched him. You had to be a bit afraid of him. You had to not have too much pride. I think some girls would leave, right? They couldn't take it. I was always intimidated in admiration of his talent, but he was very impish. And once you became a professional, he kind of lost interest in you.
This sums up quite well what it must have been like to shoot with Bourdin. For the models, there must have been a tension between the will to work for a photographer whose work was recognized and leaving a lot of people speechless, and the fear to work for a photographer who could be extremely demanding and even sometimes dangerous to the models. So now you must be wondering, how did Bourdin concretely use the models in his images? I think a huge part of Bourdin's revolutionary approach of fashion photography can be summed up by the realization that he made that models were not used in the best way that they could. Before Bourdin, and it is still very common to do so now, the models were only used as ambassadors wearing a certain clothes from a certain brand. Having made this observation, Bourdin quickly started avoiding to rely on a model's face in his commercial work. This is particularly remarkable in his work for Charles Jourdan. While it might seem a bit odd at first not showing a model's face in fashion photography, I think it not only participated in Bourdin's artistic success, but it also helped the brands he worked with stand out from the crowd. So to avoid showing the model's face, he used plenty of techniques. For example, he cropped the model and only let a part of her body in the frame, often the legs in the case of the Jourdan campaigns. He would also show the model in its entirety but hide her face, for example with shadows, or by using elements between the camera and the model that are invisibilizing their faces. Another method that Bourdin used was making close-ups on the shoe being used in a real situation, as we can see it on those examples. Another thing he did was to show the models or part of them with the shoes separated from them, sometimes making it look like an accident occurred. More radically, and these were maybe Bourdin's most iconic shots, he was also showing the shoes attached to a leg that was cut from the body, so we only had the leg and the shoe on the image, and Bourdin placed those legs strategically to make the composition work and to suggest the movement that the model was making. The most radical movement was when Bourdin completely removed any trace of the model and only displayed the shoes in images with what was at the time a very strong narrative element for fashion campaigns. In this image, for example, we can see the literal death of the model. Maybe Bourdin was trying to make a metaphor here to what he saw as an evolution of fashion photography, an analysis that is shared by one of his muse, Nicole Meyer, who states the following: "The extreme makeup, like a mask, was stealing my identity. My face was looking like any other model's face." The sole example of Bourdin's campaign for Charles Jourdan is probably enough to illustrate the scale of the change that Bourdin initiated. From classical images that were quite boring in my opinion, to the product being placed in a universe created from scratch, one could be wondering why fashion magazines accepted such images. The answer probably lays in one of Vogue's chief editor at the time, who is named Francine Crescent, and who identified a really strong need to change, a will to be a bit more provocative. And it is with this idea in mind that Francine Crescent said that couturiers are geniuses and photographers are gods. The high image that Francine Crescent had of photographers probably explains the total creative freedom that Bourdin had at this time. As you have probably seen it in the title of this video, I called Bourdin a dark genius. You might be agreeing with me now that he's a genius since you saw his images, but you might be wondering, why is he dark? Well, first of all, his images always tend to have a dark component to them, as we will see it later, but there are also some elements of his life and of the way he was working that tend to show us that he had a dark personality. Bourdin was a perfectionist, which is probably a quality but can be really annoying on set. He, for example, tried to make the ocean more blue with colorants because the color was just not it for him. He also refused almost all of the prices that were proposed to him. Maybe because he had a poor image of his work as a photographer, because for him painting was way more important than photography, which might just have been a way to make a living for him. We don't really know the place and the importance that he accorded to his own work. Bourdin also had some sadistic tendencies with the models that he was using. For example, by making them stand in positions that were really uncomfortable for a very long period of time, without really caring about their complaints. On one occasion, he covered his models with glue and black pearls. The assistant noticed that the girls were passing out and told Bourdin that the shooting had to stop or they would die, to which Bourdin replied that it would be beautiful to have them dead on the set. This fascination for death was so strong that it is even said that he planned to take pictures of corpses in a mortuary every week to see their evolution. But more dramatically, Bourdin was really hard to live with for his wives, as his friends and family recall.
Il aimait abuser terriblement de son pouvoir. Il aimait, si vous voulez, mettre une fille à quatre pattes pendant des heures sur une situation très inconfortable et faire durer cette espèce de pouvoir qu'il avait vis-à-vis de son modèle.
I think for my father and my brother, the woman was really to be not the concubine of the man, but at the service of the man.
He was capable of keeping her at home. In other words, she was at his disposal constantly.
Maybe as a result from his traumatic relationship with his mother, we can understand this attitude on set. He was very dominant with women, using models as dolls that he could articulate the way he wants. The fact that Bourdin was also using makeup to make his models white, as if they were dead. The fact that Bourdin uses things that look like blood in some of his images. Sometimes the models are put in what looks like coffins. There is a darkness that is consistent through Bourdin's images. It's always done with subtlety, not that much in your face as it could be. It's not something gore, it's not something pornographic. The images have a subtlety, but they tend to mix death with sexuality, which is something that's quite disturbing for the average viewer. And this disturbing aspect is probably caused by the fact that Bourdin is putting the viewer in a voyeur position, where someone that was just reading the magazine is suddenly propulsed into a situation that he is not supposed to see. And there is this image that perfectly illustrates what I was saying. We can see this kid, which is probably a metaphor for the reader of the magazine, that's walking in the hotel corridor and who is going from door to doors. Those would be the equivalent of the reader turning the pages, going from pages to pages, and he then suddenly is a sexual voyeur and at the same time the witness of a crime. And if we consider surrealists as artists that are exploring the deepest recesses of their minds, it is quite clear that this darkness does not come from nowhere. It's probably the exteriorization of something very deep in Bourdin's mind. This darkness in his images was also something very new in fashion photography. And he probably had an influence, as we can see, on some of the people that are creating also dark images nowadays in fashion photography. And now that I have explained the different things that were participating in making Bourdin's fashion photography stand out from the rest, I think it's time to also look at his compositions. I have stated before that Bourdin was really putting a lot of effort into recreating the image he had in his mind. And that's the reason why a lot of Bourdin's images are featuring a really strong composition. He was also very good at adapting his compositions to the medium the image was going to be displayed in. So for magazines, for example, he was doing a lot of double spread. For example, there is this picture with a symmetrical view of the woman's legs that are opening when you open the book. So he's really playing with the medium that he's being displayed in. There are many more things that could be said about Bourdin's compositions, but that would probably require another video, since I want to speak a bit more about his colors now. In many images, Bourdin includes the 4 primary colors. The colors are vivid, saturated, and they often have a gloss on them that makes them shine and reflect the flashlight. These very stylized colors were also probably helping with that surrealist feeling that we get from looking at Bourdin's work. And of course, it was also very new in fashion photography to use such colors. And again, it's the same as for the composition. There could be more things to be said about his colors, but I want to keep this video relatively short, so I will now just go on and speak about the influence that Bourdin had. As we have been seeing it, Bourdin really revolutionized fashion photography in many ways. So his influence is not something that is quantifiable. There is a bit of Bourdin in every fashion photographer, I would say. But if I had to take one photographer that really took the legacy of Guy Bourdin and pushed it even further, it would be Sarah Moon. So Sarah Moon was at first a model who worked with Bourdin, and she then started photography and produced work that was in continuity of Bourdin's work. With regards to Guy Bourdin, and I think we will end this video with that quote, Sarah Moon said the following: "It's Guy Bourdin who made me want to make fashion photographs. I admired him, I knew him, and I loved him and his way of being. So independent from everything and everyone. He knew how to associate images with the brand he was working for while maintaining his creative freedom. The message served his imagination as a trampoline. I loved his fantasy, his integrity, and his friendship. He gave birth to a new outlook on fashion, henceforth authorizing the photographer to express his feelings, hence his influence on many artists." Well, I think Sarah Moon is right. I don't have anything to add to that. I hope that you have liked this video. If it's the case, please don't forget to subscribe or leave a like. But more importantly, I'm also really looking for comments on my videos. I'm interested to know what you think about Guy Bourdin's work and his heritage. If you can see that there are some photographers that were inspired by Bourdin, you can leave a comment with their name. If there are things that I can improve in my videos, you can also leave a comment. Please feel free to really tell me anything in the comment section. Thanks again for watching, and if you watched until here, you are a real G. See you in the next one. Bye.